Hello. Here at Devon Pond Plants, we often get asked by customers how they can use a variety of different recycled containers to make a small pond in their garden. If you go to the average recycling centre or barn sale or something like that, you can probably find a variety of different containers such as the ones around me. Popular choices are wooden barrels. I don't have a wooden barrel here, but I do have a plastic tub of roughly the same dimensions, baths, and the old-fashioned ceramic butler sinks. So they're all capable of making a small pond in your garden, and if your budget is under pressure, and whose isn't, it's very tempting to use one of these as the basis for a small pond in your garden. And that's absolutely fine, but you do need to be aware of their limitations. So first of all, containers such as baths and loft tanks in particular, and the old-fashioned galvanised tanks, are very deep relative to their surface area, which means that if you have a small plant and you want to place it in a tank of that size, you'll need to provide a shelf to provide a standing place for the plant so it's not too deep in the water. And that's quite a faff and quite an awkward thing to do, especially with tanks like this one which have a lot of internal ribs, and baths which have sloping and very slippery sides. It's quite difficult to provide a stable planting shelf. So one solution to that, if you have a tank such as this, is to use a tall architectural plant such as this thalia here. Now this one will tolerate being stood in water quite deep, probably 30-40 centimetres deep, and it'll still be perfectly happy to grow under those conditions, and it can be put right on the bottom of a tank like that and give you one spectacular architectural feature. The only downside of that probably is that, being big architectural plants, they start into growth quite late in the season, so early on it might look a bit bare, but it'll really be something special at this time of year. Another approach would be to put in a small miniature water lily, let's say, and probably not much else. But if you do want to have a selection of plants in your container pond, you're better off with a tank or a pond that has a bigger surface area and less depth, such as this base of an old bigger tank here, or this trough, or the good old butler sink there. This is perhaps more typical of the average plant size that you would use in a small pond. This is Carex panacea, carnation sedge, and the right sort of water depth to stand this in is roughly where the top of the pot comes there, with very little of the foliage submerged, if any. And you can see straight away, if that was put into a container like this, there'd be an instant problem straight away. So even in a shallower container, such as this old butler sink here, you would still need to provide some kind of rest for that to stand on to bring it up to surface level. The second problem with container ponds of these sort of dimensions is that the environmental conditions change very rapidly. If this black tank here was in full sun in the summertime, the water temperature could easily reach 50 degrees, which is warm enough to kill off some of the sort of more fussy amphibians and possibly insect larvae and that sort of thing. But at night it could fall to close to zero if we had a very cold night. So environmental conditions change very rapidly in surface tanks like these, so best to install them actually within the ground. Dig a hole, set the whole tank into the ground, leaving just the top couple of centimetres exposed to provide a trip marker and a more stable environment for the plants. Prefabricated ponds such as this one can often be found in garden centres, and they can be a tempting choice because they're quite cheap and you don't have to dig a very large hole to insert the pond. It's actually more difficult than you might think to get this in with all the edges level and horizontal, because they're quite an awkward shape to dig a hole to suit, but they do have a lot of limitations. You can see straight away with this one is it has two planting positions, one at each end, and if you were to plant a plant such as this one on that shelf there, you have the same problem again. It's too deep down in the water. It needs to be up here somewhere. And if you stand this on a half a brick or something to bring it up to size, it's a very unstable result. So these don't make great ponds for your garden. They're really designed as header ponds for a waterfall system or something like that, but they don't make a great wildlife pond. One trick that you can use to raise baskets such as this in a smaller pond is to find a larger basket or any sort of container at all and partly fill it with gravel to whatever depth it needs to be to plunge this pot into and make a stable result. So for example, if that was to be put into this pond here, the top edge of the basket is in exactly the right place for the top edge of the basket for this plant, and you could fill it with gravel around there and it would make a very stable result. Alternatively, you could just knock this out of its pot and plant it into a basket that size. This tank is very deep relative to its surface area, and the inside is full of baffles and strengthening ribs to make it a bit more rigid. It makes it a very difficult container to plant successfully. So these aren't the most successful type of container to use for a small pond in your garden. This old bath could make a container for a pond, I suppose, but it's not a very attractive object in its own right. It has a large hole where the waste pipe used to be, another hole up here, both of which would need to be repaired to fill it with water successfully. The smooth sloping sides don't make for easy access in or out by anything, and to be honest with you, I think there are much better containers you could use than an old bath. I have seen people use old toilets, WCs in the garden, and plant those up and think they look wonderful. All I can see personally is an old toilet, but that's up to you. Galvanised tanks and troughs are a surprisingly popular choice. The retro look appeals to some people, but they suffer from the same problems I've spoken about earlier. Vertical sides, very deep compared with their surface area, so they only really lend themselves to a large architectural plant or water lilies. Most people use new tanks. You can get hold of these old tanks still in recycling centres, but you do have to be concerned about the galvanising, because I have found that plants don't always do very well in galvanised containers. I think there's something about the zinc that the plants don't like, and it could be slightly toxic, and probably more so to some than others. These old earthenware sinks are surprisingly popular. They are quite attractive. They're starting to get slightly more difficult to find. They do have one benefit, which is that being made from earthenware, the volume and the mass of the container actually does stabilise the water conditions somewhat. They've got a nice clean smooth inside, there's no toxic material used in their construction, so they can make quite an attractive pond. Their principal disadvantage is that they are extremely heavy. I've just struggled to lift this one up now, and it's not something you want to be taking down to the end of your garden very often. Another good reason for setting these vessels into the ground is to allow wildlife access in and out of the pond. If this pond was just to be a few centimetres above ground level, it's possible that something like a hedgehog could clamber up to the edge to take a drink and fall in and not be able to escape. So it's very important to place some sort of material, shallow beach, edging, something in the pond to allow any animals that have fallen into the pond to escape just as easily. The last thing that anybody intends to do is to install a death trap in their garden. But if you're not careful and you use a very small container in full sun, you can end up doing exactly that. A tank such as this one will only hold a few bucketfuls of water and can easily dry out in a couple of hot summer weeks. So if it's been in the ground for a little while and animals have found it, maybe frogs have spawned in it, insects have started to reproduce in it, and you go away for 2 weeks with no other arrangements in place, you could come back to find it completely dry and everything in the pond is dead. So obviously you don't want to get that. It will help to insert it in the ground to stop the water evaporating quite so fast, but really you do need to ask somebody to check on your pond if the weather's likely to be hot when you're away. You can get a lot more inspiration and ideas and information in my new book. It's called Ponds, a practical guide to design, construction and planting. You can buy it through Devon Pond Plant's website or from Amazon or all the usual sources or your local bookshop.